Well, if you've been following Sarah's Country this week, we have been following the new environmental standards for freshwater very closely with Karina Jordan from Beef and Lamb on Monday and following it through now to our next guest. A lot of officials, regional councils, farmer lobby groups and industry bodies have been leaning all week on government officials to explain, particularly to Otago and Southland farmers who are most affected, how they're going to meet these tough new regulations controlling winter grazing. As outlined in a story now on farmersweekly.co.nz from agri-journalist Neil Wallace, new regulations that will come into force next week will restrict the sowing of winter crops to slopes less than 10 degrees. It will limit pugging, and that is, of course, regardless of an adverse weather event, and require graze paddocks to be resowed by early October. Absolutely understand the mission to have healthy, fresh waterways, but has this gone too far? Joining us now is Agribusiness Consultant Deane Carson from Southland. Good evening, Deane, and thanks for joining us back here on Sarah's Country. I'm looking forward to unpacking this frustration with you. Your phone must have been hot lately.
Yeah, no, it's been a busy old probably 3 weeks talking through these issues. And yeah, farmers have been confused and concerned and quite a few angry. I guess just the way the regulations have sort of played out in total. But the fact that, there's been now some sort of, as they've been called, unpractical regulations put out there, and yeah, it's just caused a big mess.
Would it be fair to say that most farmers that you deal with are very happy to work towards a common goal to improved environment, should the pathway be made clear and with enough time?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a lot of activity in the environmental space, and a lot of my clients are leaders in this space and show a lot of leadership. I guess it kind of hurts them a little bit when they're doing a lot and then you get sort of lumped with these regulations that don't make a lot of practical sense in some ways. So a lot sort of almost feel disheartened and offended by it. What I've been trying to get farmers to do is to look at the intent of the regulation and to sort of focus on that intent. The government's clearly messaging that they don't like pugging, and they want farmers to avoid that where possible. Winter crops on slopes is something they also want to discourage, and winter cropping at scale. So I'm trying to get clients to sort of see the intent and try not to get too hung up on the regulation, just to encourage those proactive approaches, that leadership they show, just to keep them going with it.
How do you pull the bottom up, though, Deane? I mean, is it, a carrot or a stick? It is a really interesting conversation to have because best practice is so varied, and there is a lot that aren't doing best practice and ruining it for the majority that want to have, great looking images around social media over winter.
Yeah, look, regulations are great for that 5% or 10% or whatever it is, and we definitely need them. And I think it's reasonable to say that prior to the election that the government did have a mandate for change. That water quality was a big topic leading up to the previous election. So I think there is a mandate for change, and I think the government do have a mandate to do that and do have a mandate to put some regulations in place. It's just about how broad those regulations are and how practical they are and how achievable they are. And I think it's the implementation that's caused a few problems rather than whether regulations are needed or not. I think most people would agree that regulations are needed to a level.
Okay, so could you explain for those who are just catching up on this about this 10-degree slope and this, as I'm calling, desktop exercise out of the beehive? How dramatic is it for some of your farmers whereby it's not even meeting the mark and doesn't make any sense, and how it's going to affect the entire profitability to survive as a farming operation in some of these landholdings?
So what the regulations state is that on a paddock by paddock basis, that farmers who have slopes greater than 10 degrees, they can't put winter crops into those areas, and they can't winter crop on those areas. That's actually a reasonably big chunk of my clients would fit, probably a big chunk of their land, and I haven't actually done the sums of exactly what it is, but 10 degree slope is not very much. Previously, and we still have it in place, Environment Southland set a regulation of 20 degrees. So 10 degrees is I guess, it's a factor by 2 in terms of its flatness. It's quite a big difference from what the council had already negotiated through a long consultation process with Southland farmers.
Have you worked out the total area that it affects in Southland? I'm just thinking in regards to imported feed, if you can't grow your own winter crops, and the irony of that situation.
No, I haven't done that. There are some numbers, and I just don't have them to hand, that look at what percentage of New Zealand fits within these regulations. So, MFE have done some numbers around that stuff, but I couldn't tell you what it is for Southland. But look, as I said, I think probably my average client, probably 50% of their land would have slopes greater than 10%. So it's a big chunk of my clients, and effectively sort of their land is in terms of what they can winter on is restricted. They can winter on the flatter areas, not on the slopes. And by that, I've got to be a wee bit more careful with what I say. They can winter on those slopes if they get consent. Currently, we don't know what the process for consent is, and the councils haven't got their heads around it yet. So farmers are sort of left in the space of uncertainty. They've got 2 slope rules that apply. They've got to figure out which one applies, and then they don't know the process for consent when they have to get it. So, they're just left in this really uncertain place. And so I'm trying to pressure officials to get their heads around it as fast as they can, and to get back to farmers and inform them really well about it.
Do they understand the season around sowing for winter crops and how they're at the window of being able to provide some certainty?
And we've got regulations that are sort of effective almost immediately, and some that are drawn out a little bit. Farmers have to make decisions now. They don't have a clarity around, how legal those decisions are. And so without that certainty, you'd argue that the regulators perhaps aren't providing the certainty that they need to quick enough. So I just want those regulators to move fast, knowing that farmers have to make decisions today and tomorrow and probably last week.
Do you know, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Minister David Parker believes it's as easy as coming out to the media and saying the rules are the rules, suck it up. Yet his Minister for Agriculture, Deane Carson, has went, hang on a minute, whoa, and today has made amendments. And I'm led to believe potentially more amendments will come. But yet, under the RMA, the Minister and the Crown Commissioner need to consult with the Minister of Agriculture before these types of reforms. So it's an interesting what's going on behind the scenes in terms of who's pulling these strings.
Yeah, I guess the Minister has acknowledged that some of the rules weren't practical and has made some changes, and I think the farming industry have actually appreciated that there's been some acknowledgement there. The Minister's also left the door open for more changes, and I know there's a number of farmers that are sort of stacking up the list of changes that they want to occur. So, I guess I just hope that the people that are making the changes are well informed. I think there's probably a role for feds to sit around the table with some of these people and make sure that the changes, the adjustments are well informed, and that they do become practical. And I hope those doors are still open, because I know there are some challenges around some of the communication that's going on.
Yes, absolutely. Nailed it right on the head, Deane. And you'd think that some of these changes could have been done prior to coming out. 17,000 submissions, the highest level of farmer submissions in history of any regulation change. Yet farming bodies seem to have locked out in this process, and now they're having to backtrack on this. Could you just give some clarity around what we are referring to? On farmersweekly.co.nz, look at the article, Government Amends Freshwater Rules Amid Backlash. You can find out more there. This is to do with specifically the pugging depths around troughs and gateways. Can you give some more clarity on that?
Yeah, so I guess previously we had a regulation that allowed pugging at any one point up to 20 centimetres deep, and you weren't allowed to do any pugging of any consequence on greater than 50% of the area. If you were going to do that, you needed a consent. Now, a lot of farmers would argue that when you finished a paddock, it's 100% pugged. Your pugging might only be a centimetre depth, but the definitions in the regulation called that pugging. The government's come out and said they've changed the definition around pugging to allow for 5 centimetres, a tolerance of 5 centimetres. So if your hooves aren't going sort of to a depth of 5 centimetres or greater, it's not considered pugging. So it's provided a bit of leeway in that regulation, because a lot of people were just saying, well, that's a consent for every farmer with a winter crop. Now there's a bit more leeway. I still think that regulation will capture a lot of farmers, particularly farmers that have got cattle with heavy soils. There's a lot of, during wet weather and wet winters, there's a lot of farmers that will go beyond 5 centimetres for more than 50% of the paddocks. And the other amendment that was made was they've provided a bit of a tolerance around gateways and water troughs, that it seems like they're planning to exclude those areas from the regulations. And I guess those concentrated areas where animals tend to go to inevitably during wet weather tend to turn into sort of pea soup, and I just don't know how you avoid that sometimes. So they have created a few tolerances. And look, I think that's been welcomed, and I think people do see that as a positive move. But as you pointed out, it's never good to see regulations getting changed after a lengthy, long consultation process. It just doesn't make it look like a robust process, and it raises questions in people's minds and confidence about regulations. So it's never a good look.
Thanks so much for all your insight, as always. Deane Carson there from Agribusiness Consultants based in Southland.
This is Sarah's Country.